A pilot smiles for the camera in 1943, but in the reflection of the plane, something appears that shouldn't be there. Welcome to another fascinating dive into the mysteries hidden within old photographs. Today, we're examining a seemingly innocent wartime photo from 1943 that has puzzled historians and photo analysts for decades. What started as a routine documentation of military life during World War II has become one of the most intriguing photographic mysteries of the era. If you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. And speaking of growing, I'm also developing another channel focused on historical documentaries, so stay tuned for more content coming your way. Get ready to discover how a single reflection in an aircraft's fuselage revealed a secret that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. The morning sun cast long shadows across the airfield at RAF Mildenhall in Suffolk, England, as Staff Sergeant Michael "Mickey" O'Connell posed for what would become one of the most scrutinized photographs of World War II. It was September 15, 1943, and the 23-year-old pilot from Chicago had just returned from his 15th bombing mission over Nazi-occupied Europe. The photograph, taken by war correspondent James Richardson, appears unremarkable at first glance. Mickey stands confidently beside his B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Chicago's finest, his flight jacket unzipped despite the crisp autumn air. His boyish grin radiates the kind of optimism that kept Allied morale high during those dark days. Everything about the image screams typical wartime propaganda, a young American hero ready to take on the enemy. Richardson had been documenting the daily lives of airmen for Life magazine, capturing both the mundane and heroic moments of the war effort. This particular shot was meant to accompany a feature story about the increasing effectiveness of daylight bombing raids. The photo session lasted only 10 minutes. Richardson was always conscious of not interfering with military operations. Mickey was one of those pilots everyone loved, Richardson would later write in his memoirs. He had this infectious laugh and never seemed rattled, no matter how rough the mission. The boys looked up to him, and command trusted him with the most dangerous runs. The B-17 behind Mickey bore the scars of combat. Bullet holes patched with aluminum, scratches along the fuselage, and nose art that had been retouched multiple times. Chicago's finest had been through hell and back, just like her pilot. The aircraft's polished metal surface gleamed in the morning light, creating perfect conditions for Richardson's Leica camera. What Richardson didn't know as he snapped the shutter was that this single photograph would outlive both him and Mickey, becoming the center of a mystery that would puzzle investigators for generations. The image was processed in London, approved by military censors, and published in the November 1943 issue of Life magazine. It generated hundreds of letters from families whose sons were also serving overseas, all drawn to Mickey's confident smile and the promise it represented. For nearly 30 years, the photograph lived a quiet life in archives and private collections. Mickey had completed his tour of duty and returned to Chicago, where he worked as a commercial pilot until his retirement in 1978. Richardson continued his war correspondence until a German sniper's bullet ended his career in Italy 6 months after taking the famous photo. But in 1973, something changed. Dr. Patricia Henning, a historian at Northwestern University working on a book about American airmen in World War II, was examining high-resolution copies of wartime photographs when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. If you're enjoying the video so far, a like and subscribe to the channel really helps. Let me know in the comments what you think about this story so far. Dr. Henning was using a new photographic analysis technique that allowed her to examine images with unprecedented detail. She had been particularly interested in the technical aspects of the B-17 bombers, studying everything from engine modifications to nose art variations. Mickey's photograph had caught her attention because of the exceptional clarity of the aircraft's details. It was while examining the reflection in the polished fuselage that Dr. Henning first saw it, a figure that shouldn't have been there. At first, she dismissed it as a photographic artifact, or perhaps another airman who had wandered into the frame. But as she studied the image more closely, using magnification equipment borrowed from the university's geology department, she realized that what she was seeing defied logical explanation. The reflection showed a man in civilian clothing, standing approximately 20 feet behind Richardson's position. This itself wasn't necessarily unusual. Civilians did visit military installations, especially war correspondents and officials. But this particular civilian was wearing a dark overcoat and fedora hat, typical of the 1930s, not the military-issued gear that would have been required on an active airfield. More disturbing was his posture. He appeared to be watching the photo session intently, almost predatorily. Dr. Henning's first instinct was to contact other historians who had worked with the same photograph. None had noticed the figure, mainly because they had been examining lower-quality reproductions. The original negative, housed at the National Archives, had never been subjected to the kind of detailed analysis that Dr. Henning was conducting. What happened next would transform a simple academic inquiry into something much more sinister. Dr. Patricia Henning's hands trembled slightly as she placed the magnifying glass down on her desk. After 3 days of intensive examination, she was certain of what she was seeing, but the implications were staggering. The figure in the reflection wasn't just any civilian observer. Based on his distinctive posture and the way he held what appeared to be a briefcase, he looked remarkably like someone who shouldn't have been anywhere near an Allied airfield in 1943. Her first call was to Dr. Robert Chen, a colleague at the University of Chicago who specialized in photographic authentication. Chen had worked with law enforcement agencies to verify evidence and had developed several techniques for detecting photo manipulation. Though in 1943, such sophisticated tampering would have been nearly impossible. "Patricia, I need you to understand what you're asking me," Chen said during their phone conversation. "You want me to verify that there's something anomalous in a 30-year-old war photograph. Even if there is, what exactly do you think it means?" But Dr. Henning had already begun connecting dots that painted a disturbing picture. She had spent the previous evening researching the specific date and location of Mickey's photograph, cross-referencing it with military records from September 1943. What she found was a pattern of unusual activity at RAF Mildenhall during that exact time frame. According to classified documents that had been partially declassified in the late 1960s, September 1943 marked the beginning of Operation Crossbow, the Allied effort to locate and destroy German V-2 rocket sites. Several high-priority reconnaissance missions had been launched from Mildenhall during that period, missions so secret that even the base personnel weren't fully briefed on their objectives. More intriguingly, Dr. Henning discovered that Mickey O'Connell's bombing missions during September 1943 had deviated from the standard targets his squadron typically hit. Instead of industrial centers or military installations, his B-17 had been flying photo reconnaissance missions over northern France and Belgium, areas that would later be identified as V-2 launch sites. The civilian in the reflection suddenly took on a more sinister significance. If Dr. Henning's suspicions were correct, this wasn't just a random observer, but potentially a German intelligence operative who had somehow infiltrated one of Britain's most secure military installations. Dr. Chen arrived at Northwestern University the following Friday, carrying a briefcase full of photographic analysis equipment. He had been skeptical during their phone conversations, but Dr. Henning's passion for historical accuracy had convinced him to examine the evidence personally. "Show me what you've got," Chen said, setting up his equipment in Dr. Henning's cramped office. The original photograph, borrowed from the National Archives with considerable bureaucratic maneuvering, lay protected between sheets of archival tissue paper. Using a combination of magnification and specialized lighting, Chen began his examination. For the first 20 minutes, he remained silent, occasionally adjusting his equipment or making notes on a yellow legal pad. Dr. Henning watched nervously, wondering if her discovery would prove to be nothing more than academic wishful thinking. Then Chen stopped moving entirely. His eye remained pressed to the magnifying scope, but his breathing had changed. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly raised his head and looked at Dr. Henning with an expression she had never seen before, genuine fear. "Patricia," he said quietly, "you need to call the FBI." Oh, the figure in the reflection was indeed wearing civilian clothing that seemed out of place for a military installation. But more disturbing was what Chen had noticed about the man's positioning and equipment. The briefcase he carried wasn't a standard business case, but appeared to be a specialized piece of equipment, possibly photographic or communication gear. His stance suggested he was actively documenting the airfield layout, not just observing a photo session. Most damning of all was a detail that Dr. Henning had missed in her initial examination. The man's shadow fell in the wrong direction relative to the morning sun that illuminated Mickey and his aircraft. This suggested that the photograph had captured not just the civilian, but potentially evidence of a coordinated intelligence-gathering operation that had been taking place parallel to Richardson's legitimate photo session. Leave a comment below about what you think this mysterious figure was doing there. I love hearing your theories. Chen's analysis revealed additional troubling details. Using infrared photography techniques, he discovered that the civilian's clothing contained markings or insignia that were invisible under normal light. While the quality of the 1943 photograph made it impossible to read these markings clearly, their presence suggested military or official significance. Whoever this person was, Chen explained to Dr. Henning, they weren't just a casual observer. This was someone with access, equipment, and a specific mission. The question is whether that mission was friendly or hostile to Allied interests. Dr. Henning spent the weekend researching German intelligence operations in Britain during 1943. What she discovered made her earlier suspicions seem almost optimistic. The German Abwehr had indeed been running sophisticated infiltration operations throughout the war, often using turned Allied personnel or deep-cover agents who had been in place for years before the conflict began. Operation Bernhard, Operation Sea Lion, the Venlo incident. The Germans had demonstrated remarkable capability for intelligence gathering and sabotage operations within Allied territory. The possibility that a German agent had been present during a photo session documenting sensitive military operations was not just plausible, but terrifyingly likely. By Monday morning, Dr. Henning had made her decision. Despite the potential consequences for her academic career, she was going to contact federal authorities. The implications were too serious to handle within academic circles alone. But as she reached for her telephone, Dr. Henning had no way of knowing that her discovery had already set other forces in motion. The mysterious figure in the reflection had been hiding secrets far more dangerous than enemy espionage, secrets that powerful people had spent 30 years ensuring remained buried. FBI Special Agent David Morrison had seen many unusual cases during his 15-year career, but Dr. Patricia Henning's story was unlike anything that had ever crossed his desk. The call had come through the Bureau's Chicago field office on a Tuesday morning, routed to him because of his experience with wartime intelligence matters. "Doctor, I need you to understand that most wartime espionage cases are long closed," Morrison had explained during their initial phone conversation. "Even if there was a German agent at that airfield, the operational value of investigating it today is minimal." But Dr. Henning was persistent, and her academic credentials were impeccable. More importantly, She had mentioned something during their conversation that had caught Morrison's attention. The specific date and location of the photograph coincided with several unsolved cases from his files. 3 days later, Morrison sat in Dr. Henning's office, examining the photograph with the kind of intensity he usually reserved for active crime scenes. Dr. Chen had remained to provide technical analysis, and together they had assembled the most detailed examination of a wartime photograph in FBI history. "The clothing is definitely wrong for the time and place," Morrison observed, making notes in his characteristic precise handwriting. "But what really interests me is the equipment he's carrying. That briefcase, have you noticed the antenna extending from the top?" Neither Dr. Henning nor Dr. Chen had spotted the antenna, but Morrison's trained eye for surveillance equipment had immediately identified it. Using Chen's magnification equipment, they could now see a thin wire extending approximately 18 inches from the briefcase, suggesting it contained radio transmission equipment. Morrison's expression grew increasingly grim as he continued his examination. His files contained references to several unexplained radio transmissions that had been intercepted by Allied intelligence during September 1943. Transmissions that had originated from somewhere within a 20-mile radius of RAF Mildenhall. "There's something else," Morrison said, setting down the magnifying glass. "The posture and positioning of this individual suggest professional surveillance training. This wasn't an amateur or opportunistic operation." Nudie. What Morrison didn't immediately share with the academics was that his investigation had already uncovered disturbing connections to several unsolved cases. 3 airmen from Mickey O'Connell's squadron had died in what appeared to be accidents during the weeks following the photograph. Mechanical failures, training accidents, and one unexplained disappearance during a routine flight to London. If you're enjoying this investigation so far, hit that like button and subscribe for more historical mysteries. The most troubling case was that of Technical Sergeant Raymond Walsh, a radio operator who had been found dead in his quarters on September 28, 1943, just 13 days after Richardson's photo session. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, unusual for a healthy 22-year-old, but wartime medical examinations were often cursory. Morrison had quietly requested Walsh's military medical records, which revealed something that had never been investigated at the time. Walsh had been scheduled to testify before a military intelligence board about unusual radio activity he had detected during missions over northern France. He died 2 days before his scheduled testimony. Dr. Henning's discovery was beginning to look less like historical curiosity and more like evidence of a systematic operation to eliminate witnesses to enemy intelligence gathering. "I need to ask both of you to keep this information confidential while I conduct further investigation," Morrison told them. "If what we're looking at is genuine, it could have implications that extend well beyond academic interest." Over the following week, Morrison conducted interviews with surviving members of Mickey's squadron. Most were elderly men scattered across the country, but their memories of September 1943 remained sharp. What emerged was a pattern of unusual activity that had been overlooked at the time, but now seemed deeply suspicious. Sergeant Joe Kowalski, now living in retirement in Phoenix, remembered seeing civilian visitors at the airfield during that period. "We figured they were intelligence officers or war correspondents," he told Morrison during a phone interview. But there was something different about some of them. They asked too many questions about flight patterns and radio frequencies. Captain William Bill Hayes, who had served as Mickey's navigator, provided even more disturbing information. "There was a guy hanging around the communications tent during that time," Hayes recalled. "Said he was from London, some kind of technical advisor, but he had an accent I couldn't quite place. Might have been European, maybe German." Morrison's investigation revealed that no such technical advisor had been officially assigned to RAF Mildenhall during September 1943. Military records showed no civilian personnel matching the description provided by Hayes, suggesting that whoever this person was, he had been operating under false credentials. The breakthrough came when Morrison contacted James Richardson Jr., the son of the war correspondent who had taken the original photograph. Richardson Sr. had died in 1962, but his son had inherited his father's extensive collection of wartime notes and unpublished photographs. "My father was meticulous about documenting everything," Richardson Jr. explained during Morrison's visit to his home in Maryland. He kept detailed notes about every photo session, including the names of people present and any unusual circumstances. Richardson Sr.'s notes from September 15, 1943, contained an entry that sent chills down Morrison's spine. Photo session with Sergeant O'Connell proceeded normally. Notice civilian observer approximately 50 yards from aircraft, initially assumed to be intelligence officer. Subject departed immediately after photography concluded, did not respond to attempted interview. Note, check with base security regarding unidentified personnel. A follow-up entry, dated 2 days later, was even more alarming. Base security has no record of civilian observer from 15th September session. Commander suggests matter be dropped. Operational security concerns. Recommend no further investigation. Morrison realized that Richardson had witnessed the same figure that Dr. Henning had discovered in the photograph's reflection, and that military authorities had deliberately suppressed any investigation into the man's identity. The question was no longer whether a spy had infiltrated RAF Mildenhall in 1943, but how high up the chain of command the conspiracy had reached, and whether the cover-up was still active 30 years later. As Morrison drove back to Chicago that evening, he was unaware that his investigation had triggered alarms in places where powerful people had very good reasons to keep the truth about that September morning buried forever. The phone call came at 3:17 a.m., jarring FBI Special Agent Morrison from a deep sleep. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and absolutely terrifying. "Agent Morrison, I believe you've been investigating a certain wartime photograph. I think it would be beneficial for all parties involved if you discontinued that investigation immediately." The caller hung up before Morrison could respond, leaving him staring at the receiver in his darkened bedroom. In 15 years with the Bureau, he had received his share of threats, but this felt different, not the desperate bluster of a cornered criminal, but the quiet confidence of someone with real power. Morrison's instincts told him he was onto something significant. The next morning, he implemented security protocols he had never needed before, varying his routes to work and checking his apartment for signs of intrusion. He also made copies of all case files related to the photograph investigation, storing them in locations known only to himself. His first stop was Dr. Henning's office at Northwestern University. He found her packing boxes, her normally organized workspace in chaos. "I've been asked to take a sabbatical," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "The department chair called it a voluntary leave of absence to pursue other research interests. The university is suggesting I might be happier at a different institution." Dr. Chen had received similar pressure from the University of Chicago. His department had suddenly decided that his photographic analysis work was outside his area of expertise and that he should focus on his primary research. Both academics had been offered attractive positions at universities far from Chicago, Dr. Henning at a small college in Montana, Dr. Chen at a research facility in Alaska. "Someone wants us separated and silenced," Dr. Henning told Morrison. "The question is, who has enough influence to pressure 2 major universities simultaneously?" Morrison's investigation had already provided disturbing answers to that question. His research into the military personnel present at RAF Mildenhall during September 1943 had revealed connections that extended far beyond a simple espionage case. Colonel Harrison Webb, who had been base commander during the photograph incident, had gone on to have a distinguished post-war career in military intelligence, eventually retiring as a general in 1968. More significantly, Webb had spent the 1950s and early 1960s working closely with civilian intelligence agencies on projects that remained classified. Major Charles Whitman, who had been the intelligence officer responsible for investigating suspicious civilian activity, had left the military immediately after the war and joined a private defense contracting company. That company had grown into one of the largest military suppliers in the country, with contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the most disturbing connection involved someone who had never been officially present at RAF Mildenhall at all. Morrison's painstaking review of travel records and personnel files had uncovered evidence that Klaus Brenner, a high-ranking German intelligence officer, had been captured by Allied forces in France during August 1943. According to official records, Brenner had been transported to a prisoner of war camp in Scotland and had remained there until the war's end. However, Morrison had discovered discrepancies in the transportation records. Brenner had been moved from his initial capture location to an unnamed temporary facility for 2 weeks in early September 1943. The dates coincided exactly with the unusual activity at RAF Mildenhall. What if Brenner hadn't been imprisoned but recruited? What if the mysterious civilian in the photograph was actually a German intelligence officer who had been turned by Allied intelligence and was operating as a double agent? The implications were staggering. Operation Crossbow, the Allied effort to locate German V-2 sites, had been remarkably successful, leading to the destruction of launch facilities that might otherwise have devastated London. If that success had been achieved through intelligence provided by a turned German agent, it would explain both the secrecy surrounding the operation and the decades-long cover-up that followed. But it would also raise questions about what price had been paid for that intelligence and what promises had been made to secure Brenner's cooperation. Morrison's investigation revealed that Brenner had disappeared from Allied custody in May 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. Official records claimed he had died during an attempted escape, but Morrison found no documentation to support that claim. No body had been recovered, no witnesses had been interviewed, and no investigation had been conducted. What if Klaus Brenner had been given a new identity and allowed to disappear in exchange for his wartime cooperation? What if he was still alive in 1973, living under an assumed name, and someone was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect that secret? Drop a comment and let me know what you think happened to Brenner. Did he escape, or was he given a new life? The pieces of Morrison's investigation began falling into place with terrifying clarity. The deaths of the 3 airmen following the photograph could have been necessary to eliminate witnesses to Brenner's presence at the airfield. Technical Sergeant Walsh's death was particularly suspicious. He had detected unusual radio transmissions that might have revealed Brenner's communications with his German handlers. Even war correspondent Richardson's death in Italy might not have been accidental. Morrison's research revealed that Richardson had continued asking questions about the civilian observer for weeks after the photo session. His death had come just as he was preparing to publish a story about suspicious activity at Allied airfields. The cover-up had continued for 30 years, maintained by people who had built their post-war careers on secrets that could destroy them if revealed. General Webb's reputation, Major Whitman's business empire, and potentially dozens of other careers and fortunes depended on the truth about September 15th, 1943, remaining buried. But Morrison's investigation had uncovered one more crucial piece of information. Klaus Brenner, if he was still alive, would be living somewhere in the United States under a new identity. The resources required to maintain such a cover-up suggested that he wasn't just any former Nazi intelligence officer, but someone whose knowledge remained valuable and dangerous even 30 years after the war. As Morrison prepared to take the next step in his investigation, he realized that he was no longer just hunting for historical truth. He was potentially tracking down one of the most successful double agents in military history, a man who had survived the war, betrayed both sides, and convinced the US government that keeping him alive and free was worth any price. The question was whether Morrison would live long enough to prove it. Special Agent Morrison's breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a routine paperwork audit at the Immigration and Naturalization Service. While researching post-war immigration records, he had requested files for all German nationals who had entered the United States between 1945 and 1950 under special military sponsorship programs. Most of the files contained predictable stories. Rocket scientists recruited for the space program, intelligence analysts brought over to help with Cold War operations. But one file stood out for what it didn't contain rather than what it did. Heinrich Müller, listed as a technical specialist in communications, had entered the United States in June 1945 with impeccable documentation, but virtually no verifiable history prior to his capture by Allied forces. His file contained letters of recommendation from high-ranking American officers. But when Morrison tried to verify these endorsements, he discovered that 2 of the recommending officers had died in accidents within 6 months of signing the papers. What clinched Morrison's suspicions was a single photograph in Muller's immigration file, a standard identification photo that showed a man who bore an unmistakable resemblance to the civilian figure reflected in the B-17's fuselage. The facial structure, the posture, even the way he held his head all matched the mysterious observer from September 1943. Klaus Brenner had indeed become Heinrich Müller, and he had been living openly in the United States for nearly 30 years. Morrison's further investigation revealed that Müller had settled in Chicago, the same city where Mickey O'Connell had returned after the war. This wasn't coincidence. Müller had been tasked with keeping watch over the surviving members of the squadron, ensuring that none of them remembered too much about what they had witnessed at RAF Mildenhall. The most chilling discovery came when Morrison cross-referenced dates from his investigation. Mickey O'Connell's mysterious death in a 1952 car accident had occurred just 3 days after he had attempted to contact war correspondent Richardson about something important he remembered about their photo session in 1943. The accident report described mechanical failure, but Morrison found no evidence that the vehicle had ever been properly examined by investigators. Dr. Henning's academic research had unknowingly triggered a crisis for Müller and his handlers. After 30 years of careful monitoring, someone had finally noticed what they had hoped would remain hidden forever: the pressure on the universities, the threatening phone call to Morrison, the systematic attempt to discredit and disperse everyone involved in the investigation. It all pointed to a conspiracy that was still active and still dangerous. But Morrison had one advantage that Muller's previous victims had lacked. He knew what he was looking for. Using FBI surveillance resources, Morrison began tracking Heinrich Müller's movements and associations. What he discovered was a carefully constructed life built on a foundation of lies and sustained by periodic acts of violence. Müller lived in a modest house in suburban Chicago, worked as a technical consultant for various defense contractors, and maintained the appearance of a quiet, law-abiding immigrant. But Morrison's surveillance revealed regular meetings with individuals whose backgrounds suggested ongoing intelligence activities. More disturbing were the unexplained deaths that seemed to follow Müller wherever he went. Over the course of 30 years, at least 12 people who had served with Mickey's squadron or had knowledge of the September 1943 incident had died in accidents, committed suicide, or simply disappeared. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid detection by local law enforcement, but clear enough to suggest systematic elimination of witnesses. Morrison realized he was dealing with more than just a former Nazi spy. He was tracking someone who had continued active intelligence operations for 3 decades, possibly working for multiple masters and maintaining his freedom through blackmail, murder, and the protection of highly placed American officials who had too much to lose if the truth emerged. If you liked this story, leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers around the world. The final piece of the puzzle came when Morrison gained access to recently declassified documents related to post-war intelligence operations. Buried in thousands of pages of bureaucratic paperwork was a single memo that confirmed his worst suspicions. Klaus Brenner Heinrich Müller hadn't just been turned by Allied intelligence, he'd been playing all sides throughout the war. His presence at RAF Mildenhall in September 1943 hadn't been part of an Allied intelligence operation, but rather the continuation of his work for German intelligence. He had been gathering information about Operation Crossbow while simultaneously feeding intelligence to the Allies about German defensive positions. The 3 airmen who died after the photograph had been killed, not to protect Allied secrets, but to prevent them from identifying Brenner as a German agent who was still operating on British soil. War correspondent Richardson had died because he was getting too close to exposing a conspiracy that involved the highest levels of Allied command. The post-war cover-up had been necessary because revealing Brenner's true activities would have exposed the fact that Operation Crossbow's success had come partly through information provided by someone who was simultaneously working for the enemy. The implications for Allied intelligence operations would have been catastrophic. Morrison's investigation had uncovered one of the most successful intelligence operations in history, a triple agent who had convinced all sides that he was working exclusively for them while actually serving his own interests and survival above all else. But as Morrison prepared to arrest Heinrich Müller and expose the decades-long conspiracy, he made one final, terrifying discovery. The threatening phone call he had received hadn't come from Muller's American handlers. It had come from Muller himself, who had been monitoring Morrison's investigation from the beginning and was preparing to disappear once again. When federal agents raided Muller's Chicago home, they found it empty except for a single photograph left on the kitchen table. The original image of Mickey O'Connell standing beside his B-17 with a handwritten note on the back. "Agent Morrison, you were very thorough. 30 years was longer than I expected this identity to last. Perhaps we'll meet again someday. KB." Heinrich Müller had vanished, leaving behind only questions and the haunting knowledge that one of history's most dangerous spies was still alive, still active, and still playing games that stretched back to a sunny morning in September 1943, when a young pilot smiled for a camera, unknowingly capturing evidence of betrayal that would echo through the decades. The photograph of Mickey O'Connell continues to hang in the National Archives, but now researchers know to look more carefully at reflections and shadows, understanding that sometimes the most important truths are hidden in plain sight. The mysterious figure in the aircraft's reflection had indeed been someone who shouldn't have been there, a master spy who had turned the chaos of war into an opportunity for survival and profit that lasted far beyond the conflict's end. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts and answering questions about these historical mysteries. What part of this investigation fascinated you the most? Let me know in the comments, and let's discuss it. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into history's hidden secrets.